It's just so remarkably short-sighted, right? Because if they can expel people for what is perceived as anti-Semitic speech, well, they can expel people for what is perceived as transphobic speech.
Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Brad Polumbo, and you're watching the Base Politics Show. We're also joined by Brad's dog, Reggie, this week. This week, we're talking about the protests that are erupting all over U.S. college campuses in response to the Israeli-Palestinian war. We're also talking about a very cool new piece of legislation in Kansas that actually could rein in the government. And lastly, does the woke left now hate Taylor Swift? We're going to discuss that too, so let's jump in.
So, Hannah, I was just telling you before we went off air about Reggie and about how he's old and his legs are stopping working, his back legs. And so it was so sweet. He was at the bottom of the stairs and he wanted to come up. So he whined until one of us came and picked him up and brought him up here to be in the office with me because he likes to keep me company while I work.
What a sweet bubby. I really hate to think about him getting old. Have you thought any more about freezing him or doing that whole cloning thing?
Oh, I'm not allowed to talk about that anymore. It's so funny. With my boyfriend's family, we have a list of banned topics at the dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
Like certain family members aren't allowed to bring up QAnon. I'm not allowed to bring up Reggie cloning because they've all heard the same spiel 50 times.
This is hilarious that is what you're banned from talking about. Mine, I have the similar thing going with my family, but it's like hot
Crystals?
button.
What's yours? Crystals?
No, it's not crystals. Mine is abortion. I don't want to talk to my family about abortion. There's no way we can have a level even conversation when that issue comes up, and I don't want to fight with my family and friends about politics in general. I think that that's often a misperception people have about me because I am overtly political in my day-to-day and online, but when I'm in my actual atmosphere out of work, I'm not like that. I don't enjoy getting in fights over political issues. I don't really think it's worth it to sacrifice personal relationships. I've actually had to tell friends and family members not to respond to me online because I'm like, I don't want to fight with you, my friend, online in the comments. Like, if you want to have a discussion, we can, but that's weird. That's a weird look. Like, I don't want to be doing that, and I don't want to do it over Thanksgiving. Yeah. So I feel like we've done a pretty good job of keeping harmony and balance in my family, even though, we do have some different views on things, particular social issues. But it's funny that that's your hot button one is Reggie, not something political or actually controversial.
Yeah, mine is just my controversial opinion or thing not to talk about is just the cloning, just because people are sick of hearing about it. But something else people might be starting to get sick of hearing about is the ongoing debate over all things Israel, Gaza, in the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, but now this new wave of protests that's happening on college campuses across the country. Here's a quick clip from CBS News catching us up on what's been going down on campuses all across the United States.
Now we have more on those Gaza-related protests that continue on college campuses in spite of repeated efforts to shut them down. In Los Angeles yesterday, Palestinian supporters clashed with pro-Israeli activists at UCLA. Demonstrators on at least 22 U.S. campuses have been arrested. Elise Preston has more.
UCLA was one of the latest flashpoints between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli demonstrators. Dozens clashed Sunday after a security barrier was breached. Physical altercations took place, but no major injuries were reported. Following the skirmishes, UCLA officials moved to drastically reinforce the barricades and railings. Across the country, authorities detained 100 people at Northeastern University in Boston. Pro-Palestinian student demonstrators are calling for their schools to divest from companies that do business with Israel.
The current operations are pretty blatantly war crimes, a genocide.
While pro-Israeli demonstrators say people in the encampments are promoting anti-Semitism and ignoring Hamas-held hostages.
If you actually want peace to be achieved as we do, and if you want a ceasefire, the hostages need to be released, and they need to be at the forefront of this discussion.
As commencement day approaches for many colleges and universities, administrators at both public and private schools are scrambling to find ways forward. At Columbia University, where the country's first encampment still stands, commencement still hangs in the balance.
I personally don't view it as much of a loss if we don't have a graduation, especially with what they're trying to fight for.
For CBS Mornings, I'm Elise Preston in Los Angeles.
So, Hannah, I have a hard time coming up with one take on these campus protests because it's happening at so many different college campuses, and at each campus, it looks a little bit different. So, what's your kind of general take, though, because we do have to come up with one to the best of our ability on these protests and whether they are protected free speech or whether they should be shut down, as we're seeing happening in many places?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's very, very difficult to land on like one general takeaway because there's so many issues this impacts, so many things that are kind of coming up for me, and there's a lot of nuance, I think, and that's a good thing when we're talking about politics. I think there is this urge to reduce things to black and white and to ignore real gray areas, and I think happens to be one where there's a lot of gray area to sort through. But I guess if I had to have one general takeaway, I am always happy to see people stand up against war. I am always happy to see people discover the violence and the injustice of our military industrial complex and many of the conflicts that it gets involved with and supports. I think that having anti war movements in this country is more important now than probably any other point in history. I am at the same time equally devastated that there is so much anti Semitism mixed up in these protests, that the protesters do not seem to have been able to separate themselves from the hatred and vitriol that is motivating some people who are showing up in these spaces. And I was in New York City last week. I was actually staying in Columbus Circle to do Fox News. And so obviously we were talking about this a lot there. It was a very weird presence in New York. I can't say this for sure, but at my hotel, it seemed to be that there were a lot of National Guard type people. There were a lot of people carrying like big men carrying camo backpacks around, which you just don't see in New York City. I lived there for a period of time. That is not the norm around that part of town or really anywhere in Manhattan. And I am very concerned about the overreach of government in these particular matters. I immediately think back to the Vietnam War era, where we did see the government actually infiltrate college campuses to shut down protests against that war and actually killed kids at Kent State. And I believe another university as well in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that we need to be very, very cautious against overreacting to what's happening on these college campuses. I think that hate speech is still speech. I care about upholding free speech most of all. I think you overcome hate speech with better speech, which I think we'll get to, but we've seen some examples of that happening on college campuses over the past week. What you don't do is use the force of government to come in and shut down dissent, shut down protest, and to erode people's freedom of speech. So those are my like primary concerns I have. I'm not sure I landed on just one for you, but I did my best.
No, that's okay. Like you said, it has a lot of nuance. For me, I defend the rights of these people, even the most extreme ones who are anti Semitic, who are pro Hamas. That's not all of them, but that's certainly an element. It's difficult to ascertain exactly how pervasive it is. The ones who aren't, because on them, I wouldn't even call them anti-war, because if you're pro-Hamas, well, Hamas is pro-war, right? Hamas is just a different side of a war, right? They want to target civilians and kill people as well. So, but there obviously is some degree of a genuine uprising here, and I completely support their right to speak and protest on college campuses, even if other people find their message deeply, deeply offensive and controversial. What's hard for me is that a lot of this does appear to be crossing the line past protected speech into unprotected actions. So, for example, we're seeing barricades where they are blocking people from getting into public spaces, libraries, classrooms. They are setting up encampments where they are occupying and building tent cities in the middle of a quad. None of that is free speech. None of that is protected by the First Amendment. And I do think it's fair to use campus police or whatever to disperse that kind of thing, because your rights to speak do end when you start infringing on somebody else's ability to actually participate in the educational environment. In the same way, like, we'd never accept that MAGA supporters could take over and set up a camp in a public library. You can't really set up encampments on public space that other people are supposed to be allowed to use, and then start denying people access to that space, which is what's happening at a lot of these encampments. So I think there's this line to be drawn here by between letting them say their piece and have their protests without enabling or tolerating unlawful actions that go beyond speech.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you make excellent points. And it's worth pointing out as well that many of these institutions are private and they don't have to allow you to stay and do this on their campuses. You often enter into a code of ethics. And if you don't abide by that, they can remove you. I know at Belmont University, where I went to school, which was formerly a Christian school, you could not drink on campus. And if they caught you drinking on campus, they could kick you out, right? You could not have like boys in your dorm room. There were just certain codes of ethics you had to follow. And so I would think that the vast majority of these instances where you see students actually taking it beyond speech and blocking the rights of others, impeding just the general course of daily business activity at the universities would be a removable offense. What I think is interesting and kind of a second layer to this is the fact that many of these universities do not seem all that bothered. These are the same universities we've heard talking about safe spaces and microaggressions and the need to protect people's feelings from harmful speech in many other instances in the past. And now you have some pretty overt actions taking place that it would be justifiable for them to take action against. And yet instead we're seeing the faculty join the protest and they're not actually kicking kids out. So there's a lot
Well,
of
some of them
questions
are
to
kicking
ask
them
here.
out. I don't know if you've seen the footage from Texas with the
Yes.
phalanx of National Guard rolling in and kicking and just forcing all these
But see, I'm
students out. And
opposed to that. I'm opposed to that. I don't think that the government should
I
be
would
doing that.
think that that should be an absolute last resort. And it feels like they really jumped the gun and we're just going to have a show of force. I would say you should exhaust every available opportunity, and that using National Guard to remove them should be a last resort. Whereas I feel like Greg Abbott in Texas, the governor there, was just like, nope, we're going to shut this down, go full ham. And obviously, when we're talking about protests that aren't violent, even if they are going beyond speech, violence should be the last resort to shut it down. There's probably many layers of, threatening school discipline sanctions or even campus police getting involved before the Texas National Guard coming in and kicking ass. I agree. I thought that was part of what we're seeing as an over. So I think we're simultaneously seeing these protesters overstep the bounds of what they're entitled to do in many cases, and then also an opposite pendulum swing of overreaction from many government officials, especially Republican officials, where they're going full Leroy Jenkins on these protesters when many of them are the same Republicans who've been quite rightly crying about free speech for years.
Hmm. I can't really think of many circumstances where I would think it's justifiable to turn the American military on the American people. I think if there are kids who are violating the law, who are harming people on those campuses, arrest them. Sure, right? I mean, absolutely. But sending the National Guard in to a protest is just something I'm never ever going to really support. And again, that harkens back to really dark days in our history where the National Guard killed kids at Kent State over this very similar circumstance just a few decades ago, right? I wasn't alive when that happened, but even I am hyper aware of that history. That should cause concern for everybody that they
Yeah,
are
I don't
going to
understand why
release.
police can't handle it.
They
Why do we
can.
need the National Guard? Police can arrest these
I mean,
people.
you've already militarized the police. They have freaking tanks. They've got like weapons of war already. So exactly. It's just, it is what you were saying. It is more, it's virtue signaling from the right more than anything, right? Like, look how tough we are. We won't stand for this. And it is because I think the right is in knee-jerk support of Israel and it wants to tamp down this dissent. It doesn't want to hear criticisms of this conflict. I really do hate this trajectory we've seen in the past decade, especially where I feel like many protests start off with like very good reason with very valid points, and then they get co-opted because they don't manage their spaces. They don't control the people that they allow to like join their movements. And really, if you look at successful protests of the past in American history, they did the exact opposite. They very much policed their ranks. They trained, they were disciplined. They made sure that they did not let unruly, violent, hateful people infiltrate, because they recognize that when you do that, your original point is lost. And I think that is what's happening with these protests. I think many of the people who are there have genuine points, but they are being overtaken and drowned out by the people who are hateful. And as you pointed out, the people who are actually pro-war themselves, because being pro-Hamas is completely unhinged. And it's just very unfortunate because I do think we need to have a serious conversation about our involvement in this conflict and others like it. That's not going to happen because they have not done a good job of like self-policing and shutting this down. So I ultimately
Yeah.
think it's a worthless protest at this point anyways, and they probably should just move on. And last thing I'll add is I do think it's an oddly coordinated protest. It does make me wonder, like, what monetary interests are funneling into these student organizations, because I've done student organizing. It's hard. It doesn't usually roll out like this so neatly all of a sudden across the country. We've got all these groups that just so happen to be popping up. It does make me wonder, especially given the timing of it, if there are other entities that are involved with funding this movement.
Could be. It also could be kind of like TikTok is catching fire with these protests, and it could be kind of an organic social media phenomenon of copycats from social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing I did want to say, though, is I really question what the point of these protests is, in that I actually have noticed over the last week or so that the protests have become the main subject of news coverage rather than the actual war,
Right.
which would seem to me that if your goal is to highlight the loss of life and the tragic toll and what they see as unjustified killing of mass civilians on purpose in their view, I don't want to get into the whole conflict, right? But like that actually drawing attention to yourself like this might not actually be advancing that. And two, like I understand a lot of them are protesting to end US aid to Israel's war. That is a valid protest complaint. That's something I personally agree with. However, the thing is about divesting from companies that do business with Israel, or divesting the endowment investments for the university. All of that seems kind of nonsense to me, in that, like, I'm not sure how much of it that wouldn't make any difference to what Bibi Netanyahu is not going to be like. Well, Columbia University's endowment sold off its shares in some Israeli-based biochemical companies, so we're going to lay down our arms. Like, I'm not sure what they would accomplish. I've also heard some people who understand these things far better than I do explain that it's like not their demands aren't even really possible unless you were to totally divest from like market indexes and 401ks and that kind of thing. So I don't know why they're obsessing with this divestiture thing, especially because I've never understood the idea of boycotting the entire nation of Israel and all its businesses because you disagree with its government. I mean,
Yeah.
I do business with American businesses every single day of my life, despite disagreeing with like 90% of what the American government does. I don't. So I guess I'm really not sure what the tangible goals of these protests are that actually make sense and are possible, or whether they're really serving those goals at this point.
Well, they're very non-specific, which is another thing that I've thought is very interesting, right? Just divest, divest, divest from what? If you were to go and ask any of these individuals, particularly what they wanted them to divest from, I very much doubt that you would get any solid answers. To me, these protests at best remind me of like the Instagram Black Square movement, where you saw a whole bunch of left-wing people throwing up black squares during BLM. Why? They couldn't tell you. They just thought it was like to show, symbolically that they stood with this movement, and really it was like actually harming the movement because they were so far removed from the actual work going on the ground that they couldn't even actually actively participate online. I think this often happens with like social woke activism. I don't see this as much on the right. It's definitely more of a like social justice warrior impact, where they don't want to do the real work. They don't actually show up. They don't go to the state capitals. They aren't involved in the actual processes. They're not in coalitions. They're not working for organizations, but they get riled up online. And that's fine. That can be a first step into political activism, but then they don't actually do the work to learn how to be effective advocates for what they're seeking. And they just kind of start following the tide and posting memes or posting squares or marching. And like, that's not really how things change. That's not really how you get things done politically for the most part. And so it can often end up setting your movement back, or you just look really silly in the process. I would say this is an example of both. You were actively setting your effort to get us out of this conflict back, because your whole narrative now is overrun with anti-Semitism and hatred and just total chaos. You're not changing people's minds. If anything, you're making them dig their heels in. And I think that is often the consequence of trying to get involved in politics without doing the work to know what you're doing.
I do want to take a minute and talk about the Republican response to these protests, which not all Republicans, but some Republican elected officials are essentially doing a 180 on free speech and embracing progressive rhetoric and progressive policies on hate speech amid all of this. Here is Oklahoma Governor, a Republican, Kevin Stitt, in a Fox News interview that he just did.
The numbers of people who disagree with me and you is staggering. Does it make you down on the future generation of leaders in our country?
You know, I mean, listen, well, number one, I don't think it's going to be the majority. I think it's a very small minority that are super vocal. They need to be held accountable. I wish every young person could watch the video of the GoPro cameras on October 7th. These people with machine guns that literally there was a concert going on for young people, and they came in and just started mowing them down. That's not right. And I mean, who are these people that are saying that they encourage that or they stand with Hamas? Man, I would kick them out of the universities. This is unbelievable. This is hate speech. The Jewish community, just everybody that's for right and wrong should be absolutely opposed to this.
See, you know, it's amazing. A professor at Columbia, probably looks like 73 years old, comes out and says, the kids are right to do this, not hate speech, nothing anti-Semitic happening, and Israel is the one wrong. This Kamani James he's one of the leaders over in Columbia. He was kicked off campus because he was basically saying kill the Jews, and this guy has about 4 pronouns next to his name that he wants to be called. How would he be handled over in Gaza? You think they'd be tolerant of his gender fluidness? I don't think so.
Yeah. You're exactly right. The same people they're protecting, I mean, it's just unbelievable. The human rights, the violations from these terrorist organizations. These people need to get their head examined when they're standing with these terrorist groups.
And just so you know, in Oklahoma, you try it, they're going to be taken down. You just heard it from the governor. And best of luck to everybody trying to recover from those vicious tornadoes. Thanks so much, Governor.
So, Hannah, don't think for a second that we are misunderstanding him or perhaps the governor communicated himself poorly. No, he really did say that. He put out a follow-up tweet doubling down, and he wrote, "If you're standing with these terrorist groups, it's time to get your head examined. We're all about free speech in Oklahoma, but hate speech isn't going to be tolerated." Where have I heard that one before? Oh, that's right. From every woke leftist pushing censorship ever. And now apparently some Republicans are on board with that. With Republicans like this, who needs Democrats?
Yeah, I can't say I'm surprised. I think I've been ringing the alarm on Republicans and their ankle deep support for free speech for some time. They talk a better game on free speech, but if you watch what they're doing at a policy level, it's been pretty bad for a minute. And I think that they kind of have equal blood on their hands when it comes to constitutional infringements on free speech. So this doesn't surprise me, but man, you think they'd be a little bit less hypocritical just in their talking points around it after they've been, decrying hate speech and how there's no such thing and how this is a ridiculous classification for over a decade now. And then to turn around and start using it when they feel like it's hate speech directed at people that are in their constituencies. Let's be honest, that's what's really happening. And so it's frustrating, but it's not surprising whatsoever. I think Republicans, they have a vested interest in continuing to fund this conflict. I think a lot of them are getting pretty big donations from different organizations and entities to get their support, to keep them in support. It's a little demoralizing because I think over the past, 5-6 years, it has seemed like Republicans became a bit more anti-war under Trump and certainly had more of a America first approach, both when it came to domestic and foreign policy and wanting to keep our tax dollars here. I thought that was probably the most valid policy agenda point under the entire Trump administration. That was where I overlapped with them the most. But it seems that is out the window the minute that Israel comes up as the country in question. So it's severe backtracking. It's not principled and it's not constitutional. But I think this was always going to be the result. And the last thing I'll add is, I do think these protests have massively failed to police themselves. I think they've lost the plot. But I also think there's never been a protest in history Republicans have liked. They tend to clamp down on them. They tend to try to point to the most extreme people who show up at them. They often really do have a sort of tough on crime reaction to protest and wanting to shut them down and handle the people who are involved in them quite aggressively. And they also do tend to have a history, I would say both Republicans and Democrats do this, of tying any anti-war stances to the most extremes and to the worst motivations that might be in those camps. So when you were talking about the war on terror under George W. Bush, if you were against that, then you were pro-Al-Qaeda. If you were against funding Ukraine, you were pro-Putin. Now, if you're against funding Israel, you're pro-Hamas. And certainly, are there people that fall into those camps who oppose our intervention in those conflicts? Sure. But the vast majority of people, I think, who oppose our involvement in these conflicts are not coming from this place. And instead, they malign them and they try to tie all of them to the racists, to the extremists, to the vile people who do attach themselves to these movements. And to me, the jig is up on that. I don't fall for that anymore. I feel like they are the boy that cried wolf on that. I don't really give that much credence. But whether or not that holds weight to the vast majority of the American people still, I'm not really sure. Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, I just wonder, have they not thought this through? I mean, first off, it shouldn't be that difficult to say, I support free speech. Some of these protests are going beyond speech into unlawful action, and we will use law enforcement to stop that. Right? Like Republicans don't have to just let them do whatever they want in the name of free speech. There is an actual middle ground to be had there. However, to start saying hates that students at public colleges, which are bound by the First Amendment, should be expelled for hate speech is flagrantly unconstitutional, first of all. But secondly, it's just so remarkably short-sighted, right? Because if they can expel people for what is perceived as anti-Semitic speech, well, they can expel people for what is perceived as transphobic speech. And that would include basically all mainstream conservative opinion at this point. They could expel people for racist speech, by which they might define any conservative position on immigration. They can expel people for sexist hate speech, by which they might define wanting to, in their view, control women's bodies by banning abortion, right? It's like we have seen time and time again how vague hate speech justifications are used to silence dissent and censor minority opinions. And on college campuses, those minority opinions tend to be on the right.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have Republicans fully embracing this framework, not seeming to realize they are setting the stage for their own demise. I feel like I'm going insane. I don't know how they can't see this.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. This might be a little bit of a tangent, but I'm curious for your thoughts. I feel that the ban on TikTok that passed last week was at least in large part motivated by the desire to tamp down on the free speech happening on that app, particularly around this conflict. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the data privacy concerns that they cite as justification aren't non-existent. They're not made up, but they are exaggerated. And I think for some of these people, they are a pretext. And they really want to ban TikTok because they don't like the ideas and messages being expressed on the app and reaching huge audiences. Some of them have openly said that, actually, some of the Republicans who support this legislation, but a lot of them have kind of kept mum about it because that actually could come back to bite them in court if they say that too loudly.
Yeah.
Because were they to ban it on national security grounds over data privacy, it would have a stronger legal case. I still think it would fail, but they would have a stronger argument in court than if they openly said, yeah, we hate what kids are saying about Israel on this app, so we're going to ban it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is some of their motivation. And not just Israel, like everything,
Yeah, no.
right? TikTok is a left-wing cesspool in many ways. But especially, I think the Israel thing, especially if you remember, there was that whole thing with Osama bin Laden and TikTokers praising him.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of that has definitely motivated the push to ban TikTok, and we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't acknowledge that. And of course, that is viewpoint censorship. That is unconstitutional. But is it what's going on here? I think at least in part, it has to be playing a role.
I think it is. I think that they are very afraid of social media. And I think if they could do this to American social media companies, they would. They can't. So they've tried the kind of backdoor thing we've seen with the Twitter files and the Facebook files where they're pressuring them to moderate their content as they want. TikTok, they haven't been able to do that with. And so I think that's why you see this new kind of angle of going after it. I agree with you. The data privacy concerns aren't non-existent, but they are currently unfounded. They can't point to any instances of what they say could
Largely
happen having happened.
hypothetical,
Yes.
yeah.
And I think the company has largely played ball with them and has worked to make arrangements to where I think our data is more secure than it probably is on many US companies. And so to me, this has been a political angle. I think that there's real organizing power with social media. There's real information power. That's why you and I have built the company we're building, right? We believe that. We know that. We've seen it. I think there are more sinister kind of underpinnings for that particular agenda item. But yeah, just want to see you're on the same page with that. So,
hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, just wrapping up my latest episode of Hannah Explains It All, where every week I'm helping you better understand the world around you. This week we're talking about a lawsuit that was recently filed against the owners of Tinder and Hinge, alleging that these websites are meant to keep you endlessly scrolling and never find love. Does the lawsuit have merit? Join me this week on the Hannah Cox YouTube channel to find out.
All right. Well, I think we've exhausted this segment. So let's go on to our second one. Brad, it is so rare that the little guy wins in politics, but sometimes we do. And I have a bright spot of good news for everybody as of last night. We're filming this on Tuesday. So as of Monday night this week, I think I mentioned this on the show previously, but there's a concept that started floating around first at the federal level. And now it's been trickling out to the states. It's still pretty new, but it's called the REINS Act. Did I give a crash course on here in the past? If not,
I don't know if you did, so maybe just do it again real quick.
I'll summarize again. So obviously the bills differ a little bit state to state, but basically the premise is this. You are supposed to have representation, right? You live in a constitutional republic. You have a representative democracy. You elect your leaders. They show up. They vote for laws that their constituents want. They don't vote for laws their constituents don't want. If they do not act as they should in accordance with your wishes, you can petition them, you can lobby them, you can vote them out. That's the basic of our structure, at least as it was intended to be. Obviously, that has become corrupted on a number of fronts in recent decades, but especially when you look at who is actually making the rules and regulations and laws that govern your life. And increasingly over the past 20 years, that is no longer your elected representatives, but more so unelected bureaucrats who are coming in, putting in regulations, putting in rules that you have no say over. You often don't even know who those people are. You have no ability to petition them, no ability to vote them out, no ability to counter them in any way. And I'm talking about, 20-fold the number of rules and regulations that we've seen over the past 20 years compared to the number of laws. Now, I'm not advocating for more laws passing. Clearly, I want less government, but this is out of hand. And so the REINS Act has this basic premise that says if an agency is creating rules and regulations that are going to significantly impact our day-to-day life, that the legislative branch has to review them for constitutionality before they can take effect. Brad, does that sound controversial to you?
Well, no, and it actually sounds like something that the pro-democracy crowd should support, right? Because the way the government is supposed to work is that the executive branch enforces the laws and the legislative branch writes the laws. So if you don't like the laws, you can vote out your representative and get new laws. But when the executive branch, and that includes like regulatory agencies, and this is what happens most of the time now at the federal level and a lot at the state level as well, when they get to make up new regulations and rules of their own accord, well, nobody gets to vote for them. Nobody gets to take them out of power if you don't like the rules. So you're subject to a sort of regulatory fiat, a tyranny of bureaucracy that you can't really do anything about. So it would seem that if they were being logically consistent, the Democrats, who have wrapped themselves in the mantle of being the pro-democracy people, should be more or less on board with this kind of thing to make sure the people's representatives are actually making the calls here so the people can hold them responsible. But something tells me that that's not been the case.
That has not been the case. So from the beginning, when this started to be championed at the federal level, it had like people like Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee out of Utah, Kat Kammack, who's a friend of the show out of Florida. These were the people that were championing this legislation. And there was immediate weeping and gnashing of teeth, a lot of fear mongering. I mean, the DC think tank industry went crazy over this, trying to push back against it in pretty humorous fashion. I'll get to some of their arguments they made in a minute. So it has stagnated defeated in Congress. They could pick it back up, but given the current majorities and minorities, it's not that likely. So what's been happening over the past couple of years is that state lawmakers started taking note of this idea and thought, we could pass that here at the state level. And that actually probably would impact people's lives more, because most of the laws that really you live under that really impact you day to day are coming from the state level. And so in Kansas, there was an effort to pass it this year. I think they're only the second state that's gotten it done. So it's still pretty new, pretty exciting stuff. They pass it, and then their Democrat governor, Laura Kelly, comes in and vetoes it. And so it seemed like maybe there'd be a chance to override it, but it was an uphill battle. Like, they didn't have super majorities to do this. And obviously it's pretty hard to get like Democrats to override a Democrat governor or Republicans to override a Republican governor. There's a lot of politics that go into that. So an override is tough. I've passed one in my life, and it took 3 years of trying overrides to get it. It's an uphill battle, but they got it. First try. They overrode her last night. So it's a very exciting effort. I'm going to read you some reporting from Americans for Prosperity, which was the main organization working this issue on the ground. They say, in a decisive move, the Kansas Senate has joined the House to override Governor Laura Kelly's veto of the REINS Act, marking a significant victory for regulatory reform and economic freedom in the state. Americans for Prosperity Kansas applauds the legislature's decision, which promises to reduce the heavy regulatory burdens that have stifled economic growth and entrepreneurship in Kansas. So I think this is a big deal. I think that this is something that really could make an economic impact on the state. And I think most excitingly, this still tends to work out, right? The founders envisioned the states as little laboratories where you would basically test different ideas and see if they were good or not. And then other states would maybe take notice of the ones that were good and start to implement them. So you often see like a domino effect when you have a piece of legislation passed. That can be a bad thing or that can be a good thing. In this case, it would be a very good thing. So I'm personally very excited, but Brad, we've got to talk about some of the counters that the Democrats have to this. Before I have you read this next actual piece of writing from one group that opposes it, I want to hear your best guesses for their talking points for why this is so dangerous and so bad.
They'll probably say that regulators have to stop our water from being poisoned, or if they don't have the autonomy, that we'll end up with, like consumer hazards or stuff like that.
Man, you're good. You're very good. So first and foremost, Democrats in the state tried to say that this was a power grab by Republicans, which I just think is so interesting, because it's actually the opposite, right? Of like putting
It's like restoring power to where it's supposed to be and away from the unelected bureaucrats.
Exactly. The second talking point we heard over the past session is that this would create so much backlog for legislatures. They couldn't possibly have the time to do this. It would really slow things down. And I think you can guess what my reaction was and what yours would be, which is great. You're not talking me out of this. I would love to see legislative processes slowed down and see them doing fewer things. And I would suggest that if they're doing more than they have time for, then they've got their hands in too many pies, and they probably need to reduce the scope. And
they need to focus on what's actually essential and let the rest lapse then.
Exactly. But as far as your points, that is definitely a big component, both at the state and national level when it comes to opposing these issues. I would love for you to read this part of this brief I've pulled from Public Citizen, which it seems to be kind of a left-wing organization. And they have an entire piece that we'll put in the show notes. But Brad, read us some of the concerns that they have about the REINS Act.
The regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, REINS Act, would require congressional approval of all major regulations issued by federal agencies before those regulations could go into effect. This bill represents one of the most radical threats in generations to our government's ability to protect the public from harm. The REINS Act will delay or shut down the implementation of critical new public health and safety safeguards, financial reforms, and worker protections, thereby making industry even less accountable to the public. It will only benefit those corporations that wish to game the system and evade safety standards and do nothing to improve protections for the American public. The REINS Act would inappropriately but deliberately inject political considerations into a regulatory process that is supposed to be based on objective agency science and expertise. Federal agencies employ personnel with policy, scientific, and technical expertise to produce smart and sensible regulations. Allowing Congress to have the final say on regulations would give lobbyists, special interest groups, and those who provide legislators with campaign contributions even more influence in shaping a rule. Oh boy.
It's as bad as it could be, right? I mean, I was cackling as I read this because basically it's the exact opposite for the most part of what they say. The problems that they have with it are actually good things. And the overall premise of it is that we just need to be able to trust the experts more and let them do their job without the pesky business of validating why they need to do these things to the American people or having any kind of review process. And it's just the fact that anybody could try to argue that to the American people after COVID with a straight face blows my mind. You should go into acting because that's a good or maybe go like play poker. I mean, you've got a really good bluff face if you can literally still deliver that line.
Yeah, I have a couple points I want to talk about from their statement here that I want to push back on. One of these is they're acting like this kneecaps the federal agencies, and now it's going to force lawmakers to write the rules instead of the experts. But the regulators can still write the rules. They can still provide input on the rules. They can still help draft the rules. Congress just has to approve them, right? They can approve them all in one vote. They could approve 100 rules in one vote, I'm sure, right? So it doesn't actually require Congress to take over the painstaking detail of every regulation. It just requires the sign off of the branch of government that's supposed to be legislating, making new laws, rather than letting unaccountable bureaucrats who are simply supposed to enforce the law come up with entirely new rules on their own. The other thing, too, is that it says that it would politicize the process, right? Instead of it being decided by neutral, unpolitical experts, it will be decided by the political branch of government. This is a false framing. The idea that federal bureaucrats are ideologically neutral and are completely unbiased and objective, when in fact, many of them are actually just looking to place themselves well to get a cushy lobbying gig after they leave. That's called the revolving door of public service, where they go from corporation to administration to corporation to administration. No, they're all political, and they are all making decisions that are fundamentally rooted in ideology. That's what the role of government should be. And so because of that, it should be held or at least checked by a branch of government that ultimately answers to the people. And it's crazy to me that the democracy types can't see this.
Yeah. My favorite part in the entire statement is where they say that the regulatory process is supposed to be based on objective agency science and expertise, as if what they were basing their decisions on during COVID was on objective scientific information. Be so serious. They are super political entities. We know that most of the bureaucracies and agencies in DC are overrun with more left-wing people and with career politicians who are completely removed from everyday life and what the American people actually want to see happen. This is a process that is just introducing checks and balances back into the system. And to be clear, even if it did go so far as to say that only Congress can write the laws and nobody else, I would still support it. But this is not that. This isn't even that extreme. This is just saying, hey, there's got to be somebody actually checking you guys to see what you're doing, because you've done some pretty harmful things that have severely stagnated business, stagnated the economy, that have hurt workers, that have taken options away from American people, that have bankrupted our economy. That it's just not excusable that unelected bureaucrats get to have this much power. So I personally love to see it. I love to watch the COPE cry harder. I'm so excited this passed. I cannot wait to see the domino effect and see this take root in other red states. And seriously, every single red to purple state should be looking at implementing this and should be able to get it done. This is such a common sense thing. I refuse to believe that average Democrats would even fall for these talking points. I think this is something that people across the board would agree is more in line with true democratic processes and liberty and a fair system. So Laura Kelly can suck it. She couldn't toe the line, and we'd love to see it.
All right. Well, up next, does woke TikTok now hate Taylor Swift? You know, Hannah, I'd always thought that people on the left liked Taylor Swift, and I think that's true for like center-left liberals, but apparently if you go too far to the left, you encounter a new genre of Taylor Swift haters, and that's what we're going to take a look at in this segment.
I feel like whenever it comes to Taylor Swift, I'm just like upset. I'm upset because it's just white mediocrity in extremes. Like, people keep gassing her up, and so now she's got an ego conflated with it. And it's just like, not only are you objectively not a good artist, like artistically, vocally, like culturally, she just has not made a musical impact that I can see. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not. I'm just kidding. But along with that, she's just dated men that directly harm the communities I'm a part of. She's a climate terrorist. She's a billionaire. And she's also just white, skinny, blonde. Period. And it's just like, people are like comparing her to Michael Jackson and Beyonce, and I just feel like that's atrocious. Like, genuinely, I would not even put her in the same category as like Miley Cyrus, Lady Gaga, let alone Michael Jackson, Beyonce. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I just feel like her categorization is more like a Demi Lovato vibe, and that's no hate to them, because I really appreciate Demi. I really like a lot of what they put out, but I just feel like musical cultural impact. But then again, like, Demi is like vocally very talented, so I don't know if I'd go that far, and musically as well. Like, but when I listen to Taylor Swift's content, like just everything, even her in interviews, I'm just not appeased. I'm not allured. I'm not attracted. I'm not drawn to. It's just giving like girl next door realness. Like, I don't know if she's just not having that star status, along with the fact that I see through it. I see the mediocrity. I see the like, and also, just as a disclaimer, that wasn't hate to people who were skinny, blonde, or white. It was more so in relation to like her harm on marginalized communities attached to those privileges and associations. Anyways, I don't even know what artist I would compare her to. Like, there's no one comparable. There's no one who's been that mediocre with that level of success. So it's just like, what do you even do? Like she's giving TikToker artists realness. And that's the truth of the matter, in my perspective, in my opinion. I already feel like the Swifties are going to harass me, and she's not going to do anything because she doesn't even care about it. Like, that's the other kicker. Like, Swifties suck. And I feel like your fandom is representative of who you are. So it's just like, I don't know.
So, Hannah, I learned some new buzzwords from that wonderful little video. Is Taylor Swift just white mediocrity? Do you feel like that's a fair characterization?
I think that's an unhinged characterization, honestly. I mean, I've thought this for a while, and when these conversations come up, it to me feels like it's a part of a larger conversation that interests me, which is just the public's relationship to women in media in general, and sort of the cycles that women who are prominent in media tend to go through, where it's like you can't be too popular, right? Once you hit sort of a fever pitch of popularity, the crowd just wants to see you come down so hard. And I don't know that I really see this or experience this with males in media in the same way I do with women. Like, I think back to Anne Hathaway having this kind of thing happen to her, Britney Spears having this kind of thing happen to her. It was almost inevitable that it was going to come for Taylor Swift at this point, because she has built up to such an insane level of success. Full disclosure, I interned for Taylor Swift when I was in college, so I am not non-biased here. I, from the time she was a teenager, have been around her and her camp and her work. She's one of the smartest, hardest working people I've ever come across. You don't have to be a fan to recognize not only that grind, but that savviness. Women do not get to climb the ranks in music, particularly country music, to the levels that she did without being insanely smart and savvy. In
No, Hannah,
particular,
she's just privileged. She's just a white, skinny blonde.
it's like I would love to see anybody else give them Taylor's exact same, upbringing and settings and all her privileges she had, and let's see you turn it into this. It's just unfathomable to me to call that mediocre. You don't have to like it. You don't have to be a fan, but that would be like me saying the Beatles are mediocre, right? Like, I don't particularly love the Beatles. I don't sit around and listen to the Beatles, but I recognize their contributions to music. I understand the significance, the impact. To say that she's had no contributions, it really is just bizarre to me. This is somebody who has dominated two genres of music at this point for well over a decade. She's somebody who has managed to translate from being a child star to an adult star to a billionaire at this point. Again, this is not common in music. You could point to the vast majority of successful artists that are out there. They are not billionaires. This is very rare to achieve. And she did that because of her business acumen and her marketing skills. And because she is typically a great lyricist. I don't love every album she's put out. I actually think her most recent album is insufferable. I haven't even managed to get through it. I hate it. I don't know what went wrong. but artists are
I
not
haven't
always.
listened yet.
Artists often have these like ebbs and flows, right? That's pretty typical for most artists. You can't just be up here all the time. Some things you do suck, some things you do are amazing. There's probably things in between. But all that to say, I think that the allegations she made on that front are just completely devoid of
What
actual.
about the climate terrorist
Well,
thing?
and that's what I was going to get to next is like the political intertwinings. It's funny to me because, Taylor came out as a Democrat a few years ago and did this whole thing in Tennessee opposing Marsha Blackburn, which I personally found enjoyable because I can't stand Marsha Blackburn, but it made the right hate her. And now she's seen as this like super left-wing person to the right, but you can never be left-wing enough for the left-wing. They are always going to come for your throat. And that's what you see happening here.
Yeah, and I'll say is she has made climate change a thing she says she cares about. Yeah, she does private jet around. I will say the idea that makes her a terrorist is absurd.
The
Like
idea that she has other options is absurd. You think Taylor Swift can
yeah,
walk through
she
an
couldn't go
airport
anywhere.
and get on an
What is she supposed to
airplane?
do? Just get in coach?
Like it's
That's not safe at her level of stardom.
no, and also the amount of like people she has to fly around for her tours and it's just so ridiculous. That is not an actual realistic possibility for somebody at that level of fame. And I'm sure she does things to offset it and pays her fees and fines and little dividends and contributions, whatever they have you doing to prove that you're, pro climate at this point. But it's just again this social media activism that's completely cut off from anything that would actually impact what they claim to care about. Like Taylor not flying in her jet anymore is not going to save the climate. That's so stupid.
It won't make any difference. I mean, I think it's fair to point out when celebrities say that they are super concerned about the climate, but private jet all around. But to say it makes her a climate terrorist is just totally unhinged.
And then I thought there was also like real racism in there, right? She's blonde, she's white, she's skinny and pretty, so she must be a bad person, basically, is what you're saying.
I mean, yeah, imagine just like speaking about a black person in similar terms. Just you would never.
No.
You would never.
And then
Woke, but it's fine because it's woke. That's allowed.
She says the men that she's dated are harmful to my community. Like what? Please be specific. What have any of her boyfriends done to your community? And you don't say like that immediately brings to mind Taylor's biggest nemesis. But when Kim Kardashian was dating Kanye West, who's like a overt racist, where were you saying like she's dating somebody who harms other communities and who's like a bad person?
Oh, wait, was Kanye racist at that point? Wasn't that after him and Kim broke up that he became anti-Semite?
It was as the marriage was crumbling down. It was in the process of that marriage disintegrating that came out. Yes, but
okay.
I guess my point being, I don't see those kinds of criticisms leveled at people when the person who actually is racist is black, right? It's just because she's a white woman who's dating other white men, therefore they're bad. Without you saying any other specific instances of what you're talking about, that's my takeaway from that. All right. Well, I guess that's all I can say about that. But the only lesson I have to take away here is just remember, you will never be left wing enough to satisfy the left wing. And if you are a woman and you become successful in media, expect people to start coming for your throats because for some reason that really brings out the haters en masse. Let's move on from here to our hot takes. Brad, what do you have in store for us?
Okay, I have a hot take. Nope. All right, so my hot take is that we need to make more TV shows based off video games. So I'm watching the Fallout series right now on Amazon Prime, which is based on the Fallout video game series. And it's really good. And it made me think about this. They're constantly doing remakes of movies and stuff, or remakes of old TV shows or reboots. But what about video games? There's so many classic video games where they wrote these epic stories with these amazing characters that could be repurposed for TV. But it seems to only now be slightly being done. I think it's really promising, and there's a lot of us nerds out here who will watch it, and then also a lot of people who aren't nerds will end up watching it because it's just interesting stories. When you remove it from the context of a video game, people who would never play a video game about this are actually interested in the story in many cases.
I don't play enough video games to know, but I guess I'd try it. And there was that Mario Brothers movie, right? Last year or sometime recently. I didn't see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really what I'm talking about because that's kind of like
kiddie.
kid level
Yeah.
stuff.
You mean like the dark video game?
I'm talking, well, not even all dark, but I'm just talking about the ones with really in-depth stories. Like, did you watch The Last of Us?
Remember, I kind of tried, and it didn't keep me with it. I
Oh.
got to like the
Well,
second
people
episode.
loved it, and that's based on a video game.
Yeah, no, I could see why people would love it. It's just not my like genre because I feel like I kind of did that with Walking Dead and I had enough. But I do understand why people grabbed onto it. So I'd try it. I could be bought in. Okay, my hot take is that, and I want to preface my hot take because I do genuinely believe that we should not stereotype genders. But I also do believe that sometimes stereotypes are correct. And this time it is. And that is that you can tell when a man designed a space. Let me rephrase that. You can tell when a straight man designed a space.
You anticipated my objection.
Yeah, no, a straight man. Like, it's one of those things where I don't think we do a very good job of teaching women about careers that are available to them. And maybe we don't do a good job of that across the board, but like a lot of women end up going into like teaching or nursing, like what their mom did. And so they end up in lower paying professions. I know I personally didn't feel like I got a lot of good guidance about what careers were out there, and also just matching like, hey, you're really good at these things. These would match up well with these skills. So if I could go back and talk to 18-year-old Hannah, like I should have been a home designer, right? I should have gotten a degree where I could lay out how homes are actually built. I would be phenomenal at that because I have a brilliant organizational mind. I can organize anything. And I just have such a good concept of how to use space. The house that Logan owns, and so we're selling my house. I've moved into this house and we decided to buckle down and stay here for a few years because of the interest rate. So I'm going to make it work. But a man designed this house. There is so much space that makes zero sense. You don't need space there. And then the spaces where you obviously want space, why would you not know you want space there? There's not enough space. And so that got me thinking about this, but now I see it everywhere. Like if I go into a hotel room, I'm like, a man designed this because there won't be like electric plugs by the mirror where you obviously need electric plugs. You know, you can just tell. You can just tell when a man designed a space. And I think women should start taking over those jobs, honestly. All right.
All right.
That's a wrap. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a like. And until next week, stay based.